So, is this possible price rise justifiable? I'm joined now by Kat Hobbs, the director of the group We Own It, which advocates public ownership of the railways, and also Mark Littlewood, the Director General at the Institute for Economic Affairs. And Kat Hobbs, is nationalisation, renationalisation really the answer?
Absolutely. So 76% of us want to see the railways brought into public ownership, and that's because passengers are absolutely sick of what's going on the railways. We've seen Northern, Southern, GTR in chaos with delays and cancellations. We've seen passenger satisfaction falling. It's quite clear that these privatised train companies aren't working for passengers and they aren't working for the public. If we brought the railways into public ownership, we could save around £1 billion a year, and we could plough that money back into better services, more reliable services and lower fares.
Mark Littlewood, 76% of us want it to be renationalised, shouldn't it be?
I don't think so at all. I mean, I hear what Kat's saying, this rather sort of misty-eyed yearning for a better yesterday, but I think people forget how absolutely dreadful it was when the railways were nationalised. And you don't really need to measure that in opinion polls, you can measure it by people's actual behaviour. In the last 35 years, when railways were nationalised, passenger numbers dropped by a third. People voted with their feet. In the 25 years or so since railways have been privatised, passenger numbers have doubled. So demand is up. People are liking something about the train experience, however they actually respond to opinion polls. So obviously nobody ever wants to see a price rise anywhere. It would be great if rail fares could fall. But it's worth bearing in mind that investment in railways is now nearly 10 times as high as it was under nationalisation. So I don't think there's anything in the statistics to believe that the solution to what are some genuine problems on our railway systems is to return to the complete catastrophe of 1960s, 70s and 80s nationalisations where passenger numbers dropped and investment was terribly low.
What do you say to that, Kat? I mean, you know, the amount of money that is being invested in the railways is enormous. Yes, fares are going up, but the rail companies will say they are reinvesting that money on better rolling stock, on better trains and improving the service generally.
I think this is about going forward to the future. It's not about returning to the past. We know that British Rail was underinvested in. That was a deliberate government decision. But really, we need a better railway that's fit for the future. And privatisation just isn't capable of delivering that. The extra trains that we need, the lower fares that we need. And right now, we're leaking. We're wasting money in the system. So if you want to talk about rolling stock, for example, the rolling stock companies are essentially just middlemen. That all they do is lend the trains, but they get 200 million in profit every year for doing that. So that's money that we could reinvest back into providing the better railway that we all need. And we know public ownership works because it worked on the East Coast Line last time, and now the East Coast Line has had to be brought back into public ownership again because Virgin and Stagecoach have let us down. It works in other European countries. We know that Deutsche Bahn, for example, has much cheaper tickets than we do. So really, we need to stop pretending that we need to stick to this ideology of privatisation and that private companies have to do everything. Some things private companies are great at, other things not so much. And on the railways, we really need public ownership.
Mark, that's a fair point, isn't it? That other countries do seem to manage to do it very well when their rail services are government-run.
Well, let's parcel two things out here. Kat seems to think that politicians and bureaucrats will run the railways better than private companies. I think that's a very ideological position. There's nothing ideological about being in favour of privatisation any more than there is anything ideological about being in favour of nationalisation. If you look to Europe, of course, what it's really about is subsidies there, not ownership. If you throw a huge subsidy at one particular form of transport, such as the railways, well, of course, prices will go down. And if Kat wants lower fares and higher investment, the taxpayer will have to pick up the bill. And what's particularly unfair about that is that will be a subsidy from the poor to the rich. The highest earning 20% of workers in Britain are 3 times as likely to use the railways as the lowest earning 20%. That lowest earning 20% are about 10 times as likely to use a bus. Why should poor people who use buses subsidise rich people who choose to use railways? So I think that I'm not saying everything's perfect in the way that the market has worked. I'm not totally ideological about that point, but the numbers show it's been hugely more successful than nationalisation, and it seems to me a moral outrage to demand for subsidies from poorer people to go to richer people who choose this particular mode of transport.
Kat, you're clearly disagreeing.
Yeah, I think this is such an outdated way of looking at things. I mean, the railway is hugely important for the country. We rely on it for commuters to get to work. That makes it really important for the economy. It's also really important that we actually give people a good travel option as opposed to driving, as opposed to flying, to help tackle climate change. Right now, people don't have that. And if poor people can't afford the train, that's because of government policy and privatisation, which is making it impossible for them to get the train. It doesn't have to be that way. And by the way, bringing the railways into public ownership doesn't mean you have bureaucrats running the railways. It means you have experts running the railways, and it means we have a more democratic, accountable system. Is that a new way of doing things? Yes, it is. Can it be done? We know that it can. We need to bring passengers' voices into the railway, and we need to have experts at the top of their field running our railway and making it something that we can really be proud of. Right now, it's absolutely a laughingstock.
Having expert bureaucrats running things is a very old-fashioned way of doing it. That is exactly what we were supposed to be doing in the 1970s. It was a disaster.
Well, what's happening with the European countries, the state-owned European countries who are already running many of our railways, making a profit and returning it back to their railways at home? I mean, they are highly capable of running a railway in their own country, and they're making a profit at the expense of us at the moment.
Mark, let's I just want to tackle one of your statements made earlier about rich people using the trains. That's an enormous sweeping statement, isn't it, to suggest that trains are really just for rich people and buses are for poor people. The fact of the matter is, in lots of big cities, house prices have gone up, wages haven't gone up. Lots of people can't afford to live in cities where they work. They have to move out. So you have a lot of people who, if they wish to have a family and children and wish to have a home with a garden and be lucky enough to have that, they have to move out of a city, and they depend upon the train, and the train is part of their outgoings in the same way that their mortgages. It's not a luxury, and it's not something that's just for rich people.
Well, sure, Jane, you're right to say it's a sweeping generalisation. I'm not saying everybody who ever gets on a train is a millionaire and everyone who ever gets on a bus is a pauper. But those are the numbers. It is far, far more likely if you're a richer person, you'll be using the train, and if you're a poorer person, you'll be using the bus. That's not true of every single passenger, but nevertheless, it is true on aggregate. You mentioned the cost of housing. Let's do something about that. I mean, housing costs are now so high in Britain that affording the other things you need, travel to work, food and electricity, becomes nearly impossible because your rent or the money you need to put down to buy a house is so huge, thanks again to restrictive state planning laws that have made building houses nearly impossible in Britain compared to most of the rest of Europe. So we need a full-throttled way of tackling the cost of living. I'm not doubting that at all. But the idea that the solution here is public ownership and vast state subsidies to lower prices and improve performance at the cost of a taxpayer is an incredibly old-fashioned, totally anti-innovative way of approaching this problem. We actually need much more flexibility in setting prices. Those are still highly regulated by the state, much more than, say, airline prices are regulated by the state. And where you've seen airlines have much more flexibility on setting their own prices, it's become more and more affordable for people to take a plane on business or on holiday. Why don't we impose that same sort of flexibility on the railway industry? And I think that you would get similar sort of results.
OK, there we'll leave it. Mark Littlewood from the Institute for Economic Affairs and Kat Hobbs from We Own It. Thank you both very much.